Okay, so welcome everyone. Happy final day of the semester. Probably one of the strangest and most stressful, I imagine, for most of everybody's professional lives. But we've made it through. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Kevin Boettcher. I'm a research development specialist in the Office of Strategic Research Initiatives. We're part of the Division of Research. For those of you who don't know us, we work largely with PIs on larger collaborative grant proposals, sometimes on individual grant narratives. We do a little bit of everything. We work closely with our colleagues in the Office of Sponsored Programs who work on the budgets and kind of submit things. But really, I, along with my colleagues Robert Lawrence and Michael Jacobson, who are on this call too, really spent a lot of time working with PIs on different kinds of grant proposals. And so, based on our experiences, we're putting together these workshops and trying to figure out, I think, some of the things we've learned from this that we can kind of share with PIs. Today, I've titled this Making an Impact from Page One. So today we'll talk a little bit about what that means, why that matters, and why I think it's really critical to think about it. We'll talk kind of about the sort of key building blocks in the organization for a kind of an effective, I'll vary between calling it, I think, kind of page one, sometimes we'll call it like the handshake portion of your proposal, but we'll kind of define our terms here a little bit. But we'll talk a bit about the building blocks in the overall organization, how to kind of do what you need to do in the kind of opening move of your proposal efficiently and effectively, and how to kind of think flexibly about what goes into that. And then finally, just a few quick bits of general writing advice. But we're going to try to do this pretty quickly. I'm aware that everybody is over-Zoomed at this point in the semester. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, but then at the end of this, we'll have time for some questions. And then also I'll invite anybody who's participating to email me or Mike or Robert in our office if you have any questions in the future too. But before we get going, I want us to start with a thought experiment, which is a thought experiment that I encourage every PI, every proposer to do when they're writing a proposal. And I actually think this is an important part of the process. So often, I think one of the challenges of writing a proposal is that we really get stuck in our own heads. We have a big project, a large body of knowledge that we're trying to kind of distill down to a specific request to a funder. And often I think what we lose in this process is thinking about the person who then is going to actually have to sit and read the document that you're putting together. And we can get really bound up, I think, in trying to figure out if we're getting all of the right pieces in, if our budget is right, if our objectives work, if this overlaps with something else we've submitted before, or I think all of these little considerations. However, I think some of the people I think who are the best at writing proposals are the ones who are really able to empathize with the people who actually have to read them. And I think this is critical for a number of reasons. So one, I think, is it helps you avoid some of the pitfalls that kind of occur, especially I think for people who might be just starting out writing their first couple of proposals early in their career. But also I think for people who, maybe have been doing this a while and might be looking at a different funder. But I think it's really important to both think about what they are looking for, what they want, and what is valuable to them, and also to think about what bothers them and what really annoys them. So often I think we think about reviewers in this kind of abstract sense as people who have knowledge and expertise, but I want to go even further than that. I want to think about literally how a review happens. So somebody is solicited, let's say from an NSF program officer, to read a stack of proposals. Let's say they get a batch of about 10 to 12. I imagine many of you have been reviewers for things in the past. And often, right, you're trying to slot it into an already busy work schedule, right? Maybe it's something you're able to read a proposal, right? You have a slow office hours. And so you're able to, give 60 minutes, 90 minutes, maybe to sit down and read something. Or you've taught all day, you've come home, you cooked dinner, you put your kids to bed, you pour yourself a glass of wine, you sit down, you've got a stack of proposals in front of you. And I bring this up because I think the kind of human bias and the sort of lived experience of having to go through this means that the process of reading proposals has a fair amount of sort of affect and bias involved in it. And this is why I think page one really matters. So I think about actually something one of our faculty in anthropology, Liz Ganji, said years ago, which is that the most important thing to know about your reviewer is that they're tired, that they've had a long day, and they're doing something that they're doing it as service, right? Often people are doing this for free or for very minimal compensation. They're doing this, right, because it is important to the profession. But they've got a lot going on. So your job as a writer is, I think, to make it as easy as possible for them to do what they need to do. And to do it in a way that I think, often people talk about there being a hook or something kind of engaging. But I think the most important facet of the first move you make in any proposal is to make it easy for your reader. So here, a couple kind of ways to think about how we're going to kind of then narrow this. So page one, I want you to think about as the first thing that a program officer or a reviewer will read. So this, for the big ones, so the NSF, typically this is almost always a project summary. Now they're submitted through Fastlane. There are 3 sections, but it totals out at 4,600 characters, about a page. NIH has a specific aims page. It's slightly different than the NSF, but I think a lot of the kind of similar elements. Again, that's 1 page. And for folks who might be writing for the National Endowment for the Humanities, for instance, most of their projects require a project description that's really, really short. That's only 1,000 characters. And then another way to kind of look at this, other funders, so private foundations, other federal funders, typically, right, you'll see something like a pre-proposal or a letter of intent as part of the process. So all these things that, I was tempted to call this, either project summaries, abstracts, but this is the kind of big picture here, which is, what is that first block of prose that a reviewer or program officer is going to read? And so that's going to be the catch-all for sort of page one here. So the other critical thing about the first page is it has disproportionate value compared to any other page in your proposal. And this for a number of reasons. So one, for most funders, what you put in that summary is going to determine who they ask to read it. So the way you frame your projects, the terminology you use, the kind of conversations or sort of context you're trying to tap into will really shape the channels that it'll pass through. So it really affects the trajectory of where your proposal goes. Number 2 is, I think it establishes the scope and the value of your project. Even if, and unfortunately, I feel like I see this sometimes where, the summary of the project will actually promise something different than what emerges when you get to like the methods section. But this is where really you are setting the platonic ideal of what your proposal is in the mind of your reviewer, right? This is establishing the terms and everything that is going to kind of shape how they kind of understand what you're doing. And finally, I was talking a bit earlier about the sort of very human and fallible nature of review. Reviewers, sort of as in dating, make a very quick judgment about the value of a project. And typically it's very hard to then change how they're thinking about it. And I bring this up and I say this has a disproportionate value. Oh, and the last one, actually, sorry, they'll say is the caveat here being this section, though, is only as good as the research behind it, right? So a phenomenally well-written project summary, right? If then they get to the actual description and the actual methods, right, and think like it's bunk, right? It doesn't matter. But I bring this up because I think often when I'm talking to PIs, when I'm talking to people who are submitting proposals, this is often seen as sort of a last administrative task, as something, right, they've done the main work of writing the actual proposal. Now they just need to go back and, and we just have to throw together, like I often hear the verb, right, I have to throw together my project summary. And I think that's a huge mistake. So instead, what I strongly recommend to folks is that actually you give this the weight it deserves and you write it. Often I recommend twice, right? You write a version right when you're starting out to kind of help you sort of steer where you see your project going. But then once you sort of, I think, have the narrative mostly done, once you kind of have a better sense of it, you've talked through the thoughts in your own head, then you come back and I think write the real version. And I think often, I would say in my experience, a really good summary takes about 3 to 4 to 5 passes, right, to really make it sing. But again, I think this is something that is well worth it. So, I'm going to talk sort of generally here. I know we have a really mixed group. We have folks who come from the bench sciences, from engineering, from the social sciences, from humanities. So I'm going to try to generalize as much as I can, but to the extent that I can. But the sort of lesson here, and I always give this with a caveat that every proposal is kind of different, every funder is different. But the longer I do this, the more I see, I think there are really some just basic building blocks to kind of help you organize your thinking around what you put into a project summary or your first page here. So there are 3 main groups here. So I'm going to talk about 3 pairs of things. The first, and these sort of overlap, what I think of as the context and the problem. This is where you set the stakes of your project. So the context I think of as how your current field, industry, or subdiscipline thinks about or does something, right? And this can be a very immediate scope, right? Like within the last year, within the last couple of years, it could be in some fields, people say like, for the last 50 years, we have thought about X, Y, or Z. But the problem then, I think is the kind of critical piece. Sometimes people call it a problem or a gap, but really where you get to what that approach, what your field or area has been doing, what it's missing or ignoring, maybe it's doing badly or inefficiently, or what it's getting wrong. One of the things here too is I've heard people advise against being too strident in your critique here. Right, we're totally wrong because if it's being sent out to peers or colleagues, there's a chance, right, that somebody who does one of these methods or does something like this could be a reviewer. So you want to be careful not to come across as too negative or too contradictory. So really, I think explain then kind of what's been missing and why you need to address it. From there, this is, then the sort of crux of the proposal, which is talking about the objectives or goals, and then activities or methods. I tend to put it this way, again, just to sort of generalize here. So the objectives being what you will accomplish using funding provided by this specific grant. Critical piece here, this really should align with the solicitation or the RFP or whatever the call is. And this is the one really where I think it's always good to go back and look at the exact language that's in that document and ask yourself, right, am I speaking to what they want, what they're interested in? So this is, I think, the big picture, right? Often NSF proposals in particular, I'll stress, really are looking for the contribution you will make to fundamental knowledge. And I think this is true actually for a lot of these funders as well, right? NIH might tend more towards being about I would say maybe specific approaches or methods. They typically tend in that direction as opposed towards the NSF's real investment in basic research. But I would say for other funders like the NEH, often I think this is something that people miss, right? Which is what is the really big picture thing we're trying to get at here. And then along with that, the other really critical piece here is the activities, right? So, or the methods. So this as distinct, I think sometimes people will sort of like blur these together, but really think about these as separate things. So how are you going to pursue the goal or objective that you have? What are you going to do within the time frame of the award, right? So again, within what they're asking. And then finally, this last piece here is then thinking about the what results from you doing this work, right? So I tend to separate this then again between value and impact. So value, the sort of more abstract, big picture, the impacts being the more kind of concrete. So the value, I would say this is for the NSF, what they would call the intellectual merit. So how will the proposed work contribute, how the proposed work will contribute knowledge to or innovate practices in one or more field. And then the impacts, which is sort of how this work will affect particular groups, institutions, or industries in the world. This, I think some of these things sort of align, but one of the ways that I often think about this, and again, to give yourself sort of a conceptual map for what these look like, is really linking past, present, and future. And I think we would probably have like another axis here, where I think this top level tends to be sort of the more abstract, big picture, and the second level tends to be a little more of the like concrete feet on the ground. But I bring this up, and I think it's useful to think about these elements in terms of building blocks, because sometimes I think when you sit down, you're trying to first conceptualize a project, it can be hard to get this first piece out, right? What your plan looks like. And I think once you do this, a couple of times, once you, kind of established a strong kind of funding history, I think it gets a bit easier. But, especially, I've seen a lot of early career scholars really struggle with this. So I think having these pieces can be really, really helpful. And we'll talk about sort of how these go together a little bit more, but quickly just sort of, as an example, I will say, God, I hope there's not anybody here who actually works on water desalination, because I will look, this is like based on like 5 minutes on Wikipedia, but just as sort of a case study, this is what it would look like in practice, right? So I think a good sort of handshake page 1 would cover these things, right? It would say, it would give us water desalination will be an essential component for nearly all urban centers in the 21st century. It's giving us a sense of why this matters, why anybody would care. Water, then we would get to the specific problem, right? So water desalination facilities have a huge footprint and require too much energy. We then move into the objectives. So this project will develop basic knowledge about how salt solutions function at the quantum level, right? Contributing basic knowledge. And then activities, the PIs will use models and laboratory tests to develop and pilot a new desalination system. And then who's going to care about this, right? So the value, again, as these being kind of separate entities, right? This will contribute to our understanding of key principles for chemistry, physics, and engineering. And impacts, right? The findings will help engineers design more efficient systems and reduce impact on cities. So within this example, one of the things I think, once you start to think about it in terms of these elements, and I ran through in the same order I think I gave the original slide in, but really these can be sort of mixed and matched. So one of the pieces of advice that some NSF reviewers and program officers will give give your goal or your objective as the very first thing you say. George Hazelwig, who is a longtime program director at NSF, who just did an NSF career workshop that my colleague Mike ran. One of the things he says is, if you're writing an NSF career proposal, the very first line has to be, the goal of this project is to X, right? And this, you'll see people sometimes wait too long, either in the first page of their actual project description or within the project summary, will essentially what people in the journalism industry call bury the lead, right? You will not see sort of the immediate purpose or value to the thing you're being told about. And this, I think, is especially a trap for early career scholars, for postdocs and grad students too, where often, because they're sort of uncertain about their knowledge or expertise, they will overdevelop the context and or the problem section. So I think one of the things to kind of attend to is making sure you get to the goal pretty quickly. But from there, I think you can think about a kind of more varied order here, right? It's almost always you'll see the values impacts as the kind of last part, but you can start by saying, right, the goal of this project is to develop basic knowledge about how salt solutions function at the quantum level. And that would be totally viable then to then say, you know, this is a critical area of inquiry because water desalination will be an essential component. So you can move over to the context or the problem, and then maybe move back to the activities, right? And say, right, the PI will do this, which will then get us to the impacts, we'll get to values. So I don't want to like over clutter it with arrows, but I think you could really think about bouncing kind of between these different elements. But almost I think you should have a checklist in your mind that anytime you're introducing your project to a reviewer, it needs to do these things. So as I was just describing, I think nearly all proposals contain some combination of these elements. But the thing that I think as you write proposals to keep in mind is that the order and the balance can differ depending on the nature of the project, the funder, the program, or other factors. So just go back very briefly, you know, for instance, in, I'm thinking about like the NSF career, might spend a bit less time talking about the context or the problems, and actually spend more time talking about the sort of objectives and activities, as well as the value to the PI, because it's a NSF proposal, but or program, but it exists to support the long-term careers of promising faculty in STEM disciplines. So again, you know, you know, I think then there are a lot of educational programs that may be less invested in the methods, more invested in the impacts. But these are all things I think that you need to think about as sort of being in a sort of ecosystem together. But as I was just saying, I think you can kind of vary the layout. One of, I think, a stylistic piece of advice that I see, sometimes people will just have a series of declarative statements. One of the things that I think can really help kind of glue the pieces together are using linking words to start sentences. Often people, there's like the old rule, right? Never start a sentence with a conjunction, right? Never start a sentence with but. I love starting sentences with but. Often, right, they're having a turn, but these, I think, linking kind of phrases or words within that opening paragraph, I think, can be really useful in communicating that this is a coherent, logical, well thought out statement. And the rule of thumb, one that I've heard before that I often repeat. So for NSF project summaries, if you've not gotten to what you're actually doing within your first 3 sentences, you can have maybe one context, one kind of statement of problem, but if that 3rd sentence is not the goal or the objective, you're waiting too long. So a couple of ways that I think people can kind of go wrong, and a couple of things to kind of warn against here. So one, as I was saying earlier, I think giving too much context or background before getting to the actual objective and intervention. So what you're actually doing can sometimes get sidetracked, especially if people have particularly complex or kind of long-standing thing that they're trying to work on. So no clear stakes to the project. This is often, I think, really hard because for a lot of researchers, you have invested a lot of time and you intuitively understand the value of what you're doing, but you need to be able to make it clear why it actually matters and who might care about it. So the term that I most like to use when you're imagining who your readers are non-specialist experts. So this, I believe that NSF will and other funders will basically say, right, you should plan that this will go out to people often say it should be legible to a lay audience. I think that's often not right. People say, like, think of your grandmother, think of your dad, think of your cousin reading this. But here, actually, I think the best way to think about it is somebody who is in a different subdiscipline within the same field, right? Will they understand it? Somebody who's taken the fundamental, let's say undergraduate and graduate courses in your area, can they get it? And then finally, again, thinking about who your reviewer is and their actual experience of reading your proposal, having an imposing or inaccessible layout. This, I think, a lot of areas, that have very specific layout instructions, NSF, I think it's harder to do this, but NIH, I think specific game pages can really fall into this, which is having the wall of text, right? Or too many complicated elements within a single document, right? It should be something, right, that somebody who is like sleepily reading your proposal at 10:30 at night can just see, can read a couple sentences, can know what you're doing, and could turn around and say to somebody else, like, oh, this is what they're doing. So a few last quick pieces of writing advice, and then I'll open up to questions. So one is to use the active voice rather than the passive voice. So an example of the passive voice would be new methods will be essayed in order to. The shorthand definition for passive voice, for those who may not be familiar, is it's not clear who is doing what, right? So there should always be a subject and an active verb, right? For instance, a lot of funders will say this should be written in the third person. So NSF specifically says in the project summary requirements, right, write this in the third person. People often misinterpret that it means it should be written in the passive voice. Instead, you should use the subject, right, the PI team, the investigators, but it should have a clear verb, right, of what you'll be doing. The other one that I think often can trip people up is people tend to use conditionals, right? This is a proposal, it's something that they might get funded to do, and so you get kind of looped into thinking, like in the conditional tense, right? So the project could contribute, it might contribute, it may contribute. Instead, I think you can say often, right, the project will contribute. When you're talking about kind of fields of knowledge, I think you can directly say, right, like this will contribute to what we know about blah, blah, blah. Even if every experiment you run fails, doing that means that it will, in fact, lead you to that sort of, some sort of new knowledge, right? Even negative knowledge, right? Lastly, the advice that I gave earlier, I think, is I cannot stress enough, right? This page matters so much more. Your first page of your actual, I think, proposal and the summary that you write about it, I would say do never shortchange these things. I think the two most important pieces, right, of any proposal are this and the budget, right? And I think you'll regularly hear reviewers say, right, like, the two things I seriously read, right, are the project summary and the budget, right? And then I go from there, right, and really then think more deeply. But, with that in mind, I would say really be careful to, take the time, right, that these things deserve, recognize, I think, the way that these things are read, and make sure you kind of hit the marks, I think, that you need to hit with these. Well, I believe that is the 30 minutes I promised to do, so I will stop there. So I have a couple of resources, things that I'll send out after this for folks that are interested. A couple of kind of quick rundowns of a couple of the more specific genres. So the NSF project summary, there's some good resources out there. NIH specific aims page, there are a couple, as well as one or two for the NIH. But in the meantime, I was wondering if folks had questions. I think you can unmute yourselves. Is that correct? And also try keep an eye on the chat.
Kevin, I was a little bit late. This is Andrea. But are you going to make the presentation available as well? The presentation itself? Okay,
yep.
great.
We'll send the slides around and yeah.
Great slides. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hey, Kevin. This is Robert. Just for discussion, something, I don't know if you would find this advice to be useful. Something that that a PI passed on to me when I was working with him on my first publication. But I still kind of remind myself from time to time. Was he was advising me to take the first sentence of each paragraph and try to make that be kind of like a summary of what the rest of the paragraph is going to say, if that makes sense. Would you find that to also be useful advice in proposal writing? Say on the first page, for instance, especially?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's a little trickier. I would say yes, in general, yes. And so the idea that, you know, this goes back to like, I don't know, like freshman English, right? You know, that you need that sentences or I'm sorry, paragraphs should have topic sentences, right? That should really be the kind of core idea that drives the rest of the paragraph. I would say for, you know, the kind of introductions, you know, first paragraphs tend to be like a little bit different as those things go. Yeah, I would say in general, like those things, so the most useful thing about topic sentences, again, is they make it easier for your reader, right? To sort of move through a draft. So I would say, yeah, wherever possible, use them. But sorry, that was not a very good answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
You can take yourself off mute to pose a question. You can also use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. I'm happy to moderate if you want to ask questions to me directly so that while Kevin's talking, he's not trying to do both things.
You were so complete, Kevin, that maybe there just aren't any other questions. You did such a nice job.
Well, I'm always worried that I'm so vague that.
I thought it was good.
So I would say one of the other kind of subtle things that I think I see sometimes with, let's say with NSF proposals, is people will essentially copy verbatim like 2 or 3 paragraphs from the first page of their proposal and use that as the project description, or I'm sorry, a project summary. And that I think can, you know, I often caution people against it because I think you're not using the space at your disposal as well as you can if you're doing that, right? And be like, it can be kind of annoying to readers to be like, oh, I'm just reading the same thing again. You know, instead, really think about ways to, I think, make that the project summary, I think, you know, distinct from the then those first couple of pages, right? That I think you can, you know, when you get to the project description, for instance, for an NSF proposal, right? Typically, then the broader impacts rate is much later. The sort of intellectual merit sort of infused throughout. So you should, you know, think about the ways that you can, I think pulling sentences or phrases can be really useful, but I would say be wary of just full on cutting and pasting from one section to another. I think it's inelegant and is underutilizing the sources that you have.
I like your advice about using active voice, because that's something for me was really challenging to kind of cut out of my writing after I left research, because I was just so used to writing in that style. I guess maybe you see it more in publications than you do in proposals, but switching to active voice from passive voice, like I had to make a really conscious effort to do that, and I still probably revert back to writing in passive voice when I'm not paying attention.
It's easy to do it, right? And I will say too, I think that's that's a good observation, actually, Robert, that I think it is different than, it's one of the critical differences between proposals and publications, which is often we tend to sort of cross-pollinate the genres, right? Readers tend to, right, if you're a reviewer for a funder, right, you're probably also a peer reviewer for journals. I think people tend to like mix those channels a little bit. But really though, I think one of the key differences is that proposals are at their base, people asking for money to do something, right? And I think the doing is the sort of important piece there. And so that's where I think, right, active voice actually matters a lot more. And I think even in fields where, I think a number of social sciences, I know psychology tends to still, in a lot of publications, use passive voice. It's just a convention of the discipline. But even that being the case, I think strong proposals can and should use the active voice, right? And so that, I think, if you're in a discipline that uses a lot of passive voice, it's good to be aware of that, and to be aware that that is a choice you can make. That said, if you read a bunch of proposals, which is another thing I would suggest to people, is read as many sample proposals as you can before submitting to a funder for the first time. But if you read a bunch of samples and everybody is using passive voice, by all means, use passive voice.
I think one of the challenges with using active voice is that it kind of forces you to use pronouns, which is kind of uncomfortable. Like, do you refer to yourself as I? Do you refer to yourself as the PI? A little bit easier if you can say the team. But like, I can understand how it's kind of uncomfortable referring to yourself in your proposal writing. But depending on the nature of it, if it's a single PI want a proposal, then you kind of have to refer to yourself rather than the team. What do you think of saying the PI versus I? I don't know if you or Mike have thoughts, or other people, on that.
I think the NSF PAPG tells people to use third person. I have to go back. I know they say that for the project summary. I can't remember if they said that for the actual project description, but yeah, I get the sense that it's, yeah. And it varies. I would say, we tend to be more common, but regularly when I work with folks on, for instance, any kind of fellowship, if it's kind of individual, right? If it's like an NEH fellowship, right? Or some of the kind of early career investigator fellowships that are out there, especially for private foundations. I do think I is more common there, right? Because it's bizarre in a way, right? To be applying for something in which you are describing your career goals and trajectory and what you hope to accomplish or contribute, to talk in the third person. But Mike, you might have a sense of the advice in the career.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. This actually came up. We're holding a series of virtual office hours with George Hazelrig, and this question came up in a previous session. So yeah, the PAPG does say you need to at least have the project summary in the third person, but in reference to the career, I think he brought it up that it wasn't really a concern, that he hasn't, in his experience, never saw a review panel knock people's score down because they refer to themselves in the first person, especially with career. But in some ways, it's kind of silly if you're not talking about yourself, or if you're using like the royal we, because it's like, well, obviously it's you doing it. But yeah, I would defer to the PAPG, because the PAPG is the official guidelines, and you don't want to cross the guidelines, give reviewers an excuse to throw out your proposal.
We've got a question from Roberta.
Yeah.
Hello, hi. Yes, a more than a question is this is a comment. And in fact, I want to thank you, Kevin. This was really, really clear and compact, and with information that is very easy to use. One thing that I also want to think about, though, is that some of us also apply for funds that are not from institutions in the United States. So some of the things you said, it might be necessary to think about them a little bit, because, for example, I am going to apply this fall for a grant from the Japan Foundation, and I am not sure how much they like seeing a person say, I will do this and I will do that, and this will have a huge impact on the field because I'm the greatest person to do this, which is very much the American way to apply for funds, right? So what you said about trying to read, if available, like successful proposal for that particular grant, I think it's particularly important, especially in an international context, where they might in fact be a little put off by all this self-confidence that we try to express in our...
Well, I will say, confidence here does not have to be self-confidence, right? It could very well be, right? I will reshape our understanding of, X, right? It could be, through the proposed project, we will contribute to our shared knowledge of blah, 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 right?
Write that down.
To our collective ability to, but yeah, and I think that, but I think that's actually another really important point, right? Which is using this as an opportunity to really, to think about, and I think to state, right? Like, not just, right, this is my research that I am doing, but I am participating in this large, often global enterprise to advance our knowledge of how we understand something, right? Like, I am part of an ongoing conversation, right? I'm not apart from it, which is why I think, the really critical bookends are the context and the impact, right? Like, what have people been doing, demonstrate that what is already going on, right? That you're part of this community and conversation, right? And that also you're thinking about how this can then kind of in turn shape that, shape the conversation in the future, and also affect people who might be beyond, right, this sort of narrow discipline or industry or whatever. So, so really, I think that sort of that outward turn, right, thinking about what this research could do, I think is really, a useful enterprise. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That was great. Well, I believe we are right at the end of our promised time. I'm happy to kind of stick around for an extra minute or two. But we keep promising that these workshops will be like fast and direct. So I want to stick to it. Any other questions, any other comments before we push off?